Okay, good morning from London, from Chiselbury Towers. It's Stuart Leasor, and I'm delighted to be joined evening his time with Chiselbury author Roger Marsh, who is a padre, a priest, and a former Australian Army padre and veteran. And we're going to talk about his what motivated him to write and his own experience. So, good morning, good evening, Roger.
All right. Good morning, Stuart. How are you?
Well, not too bad, and good to speak to you. And for once, it's warmer here in London than it is in Australia. We always think Australians are people with a barbie and shorts, and it's us.
Yeah.
Anyway, before we talk about the novels, could you tell us a little bit about your own path into why you became a padre, and also why you ended up joining the Australian Army?
Well, that's a long story, but to cut it somewhat short, I didn't grow up in a church home or with a church-going family, and it was through wrestling through a lot of different things that happened in life, the death of a friend at school and other things, and I suppose a search for spiritual resilience that I'd started in my journey in martial arts, thinking about how do I face death? How do I face adversity? All those sorts of questions rattled around my mind, and I became a Christian the year I turned 18, and then other life followed, and eventually through a series of about to say a series of unfortunate events, but that doesn't quite get it. I ended up I studied at university. I studied subjects that would at least provide some of the foundation for theological study. I studied classical Hebrew and biblical Greek and a couple of other things unrelated. And I had thought about becoming academic in those fields because I loved languages. I was good at them. And I instead, my wife and I had our first child. And the fellow who was going to be my supervisor for honours said perhaps it would be better to get a job at that point. And I had worked in security and other things before that. But at that point in time, I didn't have a job, and we were thinking about what to do next. And I got a position as an unordained assistant pastor in a church, and that sort of started this particular road. I was some way through doing theology part-time, and then it became full-time, and I completed it, and ended up in ministry in the Presbyterian Church of Australia, which is it's not exactly a non-conformist Protestant church. It's partly descended from the Church of Scotland, but it's also from other denominations as well that formed a union in Australia. And that's where my ministry journey began. So I went to a church in the Gold Coast hinterland, and from there, when I'd finished all my studies, I went to a church in rural Queensland, about 200 kilometres northwest of Brisbane. It's a largely agricultural town, and ministered there for 4.5 years. But early in my time in ministry work, actually, I caught up with him not long ago at the funeral of one of my old lecturers. One of the elders in the first church I'd worked for, he and one of the other elders had said, "We really think that you'd be suited to military ministry." The particular skill set I had, the military background in my family and whatnot, and that planted a seed, I suppose, of I probably should consider this. And it was while I was in this country, Queensland town, I became an army reservist, and then I fairly quickly transitioned to full-time army from there, and they promptly posted me when I transferred to the full-time army. I had a classic army thing happen. They said, okay, we're going to send you to 7th Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, which was currently based in Darwin, would be moving to Adelaide, which is an enormous distance. It's a couple of 1,000 kilometres by road that they were going to move the battalion. And okay, we're going to be moving to Darwin, so my wife starts sorting out the winter clothes and preparing to put them into storage, because Darwin, you only need light jumpers at most, at the very, very coldest. And then I'm expecting a posting order, and then a posting order does come through, but it is for Kapuka, which is the Australian Army's basic training centre instead. And it's near Wagga in New South Wales, which is very much not tropical. Can get quite cold indeed. Snow's not unusual in that part of the world. And the snowy mountains aren't far away. So we went down there, and that was my first regular army posting. And it was hard work, but it was a lot of fun. And because you get to do everything that a chaplain does, or most things that a chaplain will do. So it's a good place to cut your teeth if you've got a bit of experience first. And then from there, I was posted to a cavalry regiment and 2nd 14th Light Horse Regiment, which I discovered when I was there that one of my great uncles had been in a 2nd Light Horse, an antecedent unit in the First World War. And so it was actually a family connection to the regiment that I hadn't known of. And I deployed to Afghanistan and to East Timor while I was with them. And from there, followed my military career around the country.
Well, it's pretty amazing. So what, though, is different, would you say, about being an army padre than being a normal parish priest, or is there actually a lot of overlap?
Well, it's hugely different. I can't speak so much for chaplains in the British forces, because from my encounters and time I've spent with them, it does seem to be a little different, at least. But one thing that is different is there are certain things about being an army chaplain that are easier than being a parish priest, parish minister. One is that people tend to be much more frank with you in the army. A soldier or anyone who comes for advice, they just go, this is my problem. Whereas you can suspect that somebody in your congregation isn't doing so well, but they'll often try and hide it because they're trying to look like they've got their life together. Whereas in army, the chaplain is the designated person. If you feel like your life is not together, you can go and talk to them, and that's where you help start sorting it out, at least. And yeah, that was easier. It was also very supportive in that if you, as a chaplain, looked after your soldiers, they would generally try and look after you. Now, obviously, if you were lazy, then that wouldn't go so well. So it was a very supportive environment. You were quite, despite the fact that very often, there weren't that many Christians in your regiment necessarily. It was just that they appreciated it if you did your job properly. And yeah, what was harder was, it was also easier in the sense that if I wasn't on call, I got to leave my work at work. Whereas parish ministry, it was much more, because you're often working from home, and then work was kind of home, and so it intruded a bit more. Though sometimes after hours work with army intruded a lot as well. The hard bit that was harder was the army owned you 24 hours a day, and I was working as a chaplain through the worst part of Australia's experience in the war on terror. So there was a lot of, and yeah, forgive the phraseology, but this was genuinely when I was with Light Horse, so many things went wrong that the guys in the regiment quite affectionately, and this is Australians for you, called me Padre Shit Magnet. Because I had so much stuff happen. That they were like, "Oh, poor Padre, far out, that's happened." It was it was hectic. We had 2 deaths within the regiment, and I dealt with 4 other fatalities besides that during that posting, plus a lot of other serious injuries and marriage breakups and every other thing that was going on. So it was relentless. And so chaplaincy, like any other job in the army, I think, when it decides to get hard on you, it gets really, really hard. And it was so rewarding, yes. So Australian Army chaplains doctrinally have a lot of several different roles. You provide religious services, broadly defined by the Australian Army. You provide pastoral care. Religious services also includes advice to commanders if there is a soldier in the regiment who is of another faith and there's any particular things to be aware of. The chaplain is viewed, okay, if you don't know already, you need to go and research what's needed for this particular soldier. But you also, weddings, funerals, baptisms, if appropriate, and whatnot. So it was it was very busy, but it is different in certain details. And there's certain things that a parish minister won't do, like another part of an Australian Army chaplain's role, and I think with the British Army as well. When fatalities occur in theatre, you're part of the identification team to try and identify the remains so that they can be appropriately dealt with. And that's a fairly confronting part of the role. You're also involved in casualty notification, which is probably the hardest thing of all of them. That was, I had to do that a fair number of times, and it never got any easier for experience, that one, that's for sure.
No, I remember as when I was a very young officer, as an orderly officer, you had to go to, obviously we weren't at war then, but you'd have to go and break, news to, someone's father had died or mother had died or whatever. And I always remember going up in the blocks in Germany as an 18-year-old, second lieutenant, and you'd walk up the stairs in the block and you could almost hear the sighs of relief as you and the sergeant major walked past, and they thought, it's not us. And then you'd go and knock on the door and you'd say, I think we should sit down and have a cup of tea. And they would go, it's my dad. And then you'd say, no, it's not. It's someone different. Which made it even worse, I mean, and that's without doing it for, as you had to do, for young men who had been, killed in war. I mean, it brings me on though to what, you're thinking of your, serving in Afghanistan, the war on terror and East Timor. What did the experiences teach you about soldiers that people outside the military have never, now wouldn't appreciate? And obviously now more and more, or less and less fewer and fewer people have actually served in the military. What would you say the big difference that shone through?
Well, so my father was a Korean War veteran, And I'd read a lot of history growing up, and something that historians had often said was that militaries were a reflection of their home culture. What I began to understand, particularly after the first posting at Kapuka and the posting to Light Horse, was I started to realise that in the era of Australian Army and the history of other militaries, that was partly true, but it was much more true to say that when they joined the army, we actually transformed them into a different culture. And I think that was probably the thing I would say straight away, is that they are different. Army's a very robust and somewhat abrasive environment. And people from outside of that world would often find that army people to be too abrasive and too aggressive. Partly they're misinterpreting what's going on, in that just if you made a safe in general army interaction, if you suggested something and the person was doubtful, moderately doubtful, but just doubtful about what you said, they might say, "Are you on crack?" or something like that. And you would be expected then to fight your position, to actually fight your point of view. But generally speaking, in civilian culture, you say, "Are you on crack?" People's like, "Oh," you kind of pull their head in. And, it was, so I had to, there was one later on in my military career, there was a pastor of a place where we went to church was actually trying to tempt me out of the army to work with him. And when I explained just how different the way of interacting was, he was quite taken aback. Though it's also, I think, Western culture across the Anglosphere is quite individualistic. And something I observed as soldiers went through basic training and as I went through officer training myself was that all of a sudden you are your brother's keeper.
Yeah.
You're responsible for other people. If somebody's lagging behind, you help. If somebody's struggling with making their bread properly, you help them, try and bring them up to standard. It was all part of this common effort. And really what basic training was trying to do was to push people hard enough so that they couldn't just do it by themselves. They had to rely on their team, because everything about army is teamwork. So that's probably the biggest difference, I think, that people would perhaps not understand, is that there is a very much a focus on teamwork and a knowledge of how we have to rely on each other. But it's also one of the things that soldiers find hardest when they transition out of the force, is that this family that they've had around them, be it ever so dysfunctional, that was nagging them about whether they were eating properly, and it's no longer there when they leave. And that's a very tricky part of a transition for a military person. And I think that's pretty universal from anybody I've spoken to across different countries.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. Well, moving on then to look at your actual writing. I mean, what made you to decide to write about your military experiences and your religious experiences in fiction rather than doing, a conventional memoir, which obviously would have been a more normal route?
Yeah, well, part of the memoir thing was because I didn't want to create lots of security dramas and have the book kind of clogged up in army headquarters somewhere with people sort of stroking their forelock, going, "Oh, what's going on?" I did have somebody vet, and I have had somebody vet all my manuscripts to make sure I'm not giving away things that I shouldn't. But the basic, there were two reasons why I started writing fiction. One was so I could actually process my own thoughts. Fiction allows you to, if you like, take your own experience and then externalize it to yourself. And you have to understand it sufficiently well in order to implant it into fictional characters and then turn it into a narrative. So it is kind of like a form of therapy in some ways. The other reason I started writing fiction was because I saw the gulf between civilian and military people, and it bothered me. Like, people I'd been to university with no longer kind of understood me anymore. People who, they were my friends, they knew me, but they kind of didn't know me any longer. And I tossed this idea of writing a novel about army around with a friend who was a cavalry officer, and we'd been through some hefty stuff together. And I had originally thought about making the main character a cavalry officer, because I thought, regimental life is sort of the core of army. But the cavalry officer said, no, make it a chaplain. Because he said, you people talk to everyone. So if you want to tell army's story, a chaplain is an excellent lens through which to tell the story, because there's a sense in which, our cavalry officer will mainly be either in regimental positions or in, general service officer kind of positions. So there will be a certain experience range, whereas a chaplain will be posted to any kind of unit and will be able to give a bit of a broader sweep. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And I didn't do anything with that for 2 years. And I became more serious about it. I started trying to write things. And then in about 2015, I really started in earnest on Echoes in the Wind. And that became that it really started to take off in my head. And thankfully, I had a friend who was a logistics officer in the army who she'd studied creative writing. And so before she became an army officer, and I would throw bits of text and narrative her way. And she was also the one who vetted things for me in terms of making sure I wasn't giving away tactics, training, or procedures inappropriately. So that's basically where it began. And I wanted, from the beginning, I wanted to take the story from a point where the main characters are in the military to when they're out, so I could actually highlight some of the turmoil of transition, but also what's good in transition, what's needed. And one of the things that is unquestionably needed for any military person in transition out of the force is community. And it doesn't have to be a community of military people. It just has to be a community somewhere where they're connected. And because, so I know, there was one person said about recovery from trauma is traumatized souls heal best in the context of a community. And the tricky part is they're always that easy to find. And but in a work of fiction, I can at least work in with what could be and what can be, rather than always what is. Yeah. So, and memoirs too. Like, I think if I was to write that same cavalry officer who I spoke to, he asked what because I told him a little bit the character arcs and what I thought about, and what I would do, and he went, "Why don't you just write a memoir?" And I went, "Well, here's my life." And he was like, "That's interesting." He said, in it's a little funny little phrase. He said, "In some ways, your actual real story is less believable than the characters that you've got in the books." He said, "Not that it's ultra exciting, unbelievable, but it's just kind of odd." So, and I didn't necessarily want to bare my soul in that way.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that's quite a common thing to do that. I mean, so, and quite a lot of obviously that happens in the books is based on your own experience, presumably like a trade, and some of the problems or type of problems you had. But did you find writing about your military service and its aftermath help you make sense of things you had witnessed?
Oh, absolutely. Writing A Wind of Bitter Tears, like, I can still remember the physical feeling I had when I finished that book. It was the most immense sense of like a mental detox. Because, and when I sent the first draft to my creative writing army friend, she just sent me a message back saying, "I detect a primal scream of rage. Um, maybe we need to work on this so it's something other than just the noisy scream of rage." And she didn't mind the way the book went, but it needed to be tightened up. It was absolutely the best thing I could ever have done. And the third one, in a lot of ways, deals with just the real frustrations of how frustrating people can be, and how difficult it can be to work with people sometimes, and the effects that can have. And I needed to put that down in writing, partly because I'd seen people who had been through hell in a war zone and come back okay, but then go through hell in a posting and be hospitalized with severe mental health issues. And so I wanted to bring that to light, that there was a cost to toxic people that wasn't acknowledged. And that goes across both the second and the third book, both A Wind of Bitter Tears and The Devil in the Downdraft. Yeah.
I mean, then let's looking straight at the books. I mean, your central character, Rob Llewellyn, is a Welsh-speaking former Royal Marine sniper who becomes an Australian Army padre. Where did that unusual combination? If you're starting, you wouldn't think, I'm not going to, on your bingo of life, it's not something you would, probably won the bingo card.
Well, actually, on my chaplain's basic course, there were two. Well, there was a former artillery lieutenant colonel, a former ordnance corps full colonel, a former SAS regiment method of entry operator, a London Metropolitan Police homicide detective. All of these, the sheer range of backgrounds that were present in Australian Army chaplains was enormous. And when I was leaving school, I'd always wanted to join the military. I really had. But when I left school at the end of 1989, the Australian Defence Force was doing nothing. Absolutely nothing. The occasional UN mission. And I thought a friend of mine at school, who was English, suggested I consider the British forces. And so I did try to join the RAF because I had ambitions of being a pilot. But my next option was the Royal Marines. partly because Dad was Navy and he certainly held the Royal Marines in very high esteem. And because both of those services, they were doing things, they were deploying, they were active units, if you like, active services. However, the reply I got was, yes, we like your application. However, we'd like you to come and live in the UK for a time. Because, well, one of the reasons is that acclimatization of Australians to take an Aussie who has spent most of his formative years in a part of Australia that is pretty mild, and put him as a Royal Marine, then put him in 4-5 Commando, and then send him to Norway in winter. That's going to be a little bit of too many shocks. So they wanted some acclimatization, I think. Now, the other side of Rob Llewellyn being is actually the name of one of my ancestors too. So I do speak Welsh somewhat. My Welsh skill with Welsh has slipped a lot. I can read okay, but spoken Welsh, I'm very slow. And I was at the genesis of Rob's character began when I was on Major's course. Now, chaplains and every other officer in the army do courses together, which are these promotion courses. You have captain's course and Major's course. Now, some of it's to do with command leadership and management. A lot of it's to do with tactics. And you will have a chaplain having to devise and lead a tactical exercise without troops that involves a battle group attack. Now, obviously, they're not going to do it as well as an arms corps officer, but the idea is that everybody has to do these things, so you're all together. Anyway, I was on Major's course, and in preparation for trying to join the British forces, I had learned a lot of British weapon systems. And one of the somebody put up, okay, you look a little bit of dissimilar weaponry just for fun. Can anybody tell me what this is? And I went, yeah, that's an L42A1 sniper rifle, last rifle in service based on the Lee Enfield system. And there was a lateral transfer from the British Army there, because I'm a target shooter. I was a target shooter and a hunter. And this lateral transfer officer came up to me and said, which battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment were you in? I go, what? Do I sound Irish? And I went, oh, no, I wasn't. He goes, oh, that's right. You were a Royal Marine, weren't you? Because he obviously he seemed to recognize me from somewhere. And I'm like, the more honest I was with him, the less he believed what I was saying. And so I thought, this has got potential. And so, yeah, I partly out of that rather humorous interaction, I thought the other reason for having a Royal Marine, a non-Australian character as my main male character, is he's looking at the army, the Australian army, with military eyes, but with very different military eyes. And so there are questions that he's going to ask naturally that provide me with as an author with opportunities to explain things to a non-military audience. So it's a perfect prison for us interrogating what's going on, because say like in the Australian Army, the male and female recruits are in mixed platoons. We don't have any all-female platoons. We used to, but it was such a disaster that they actually mixed the platoons up, and they found that worked better. But when a friend of mine who transferred from the British Army and came to Kapooka at the same time I was there, he was shocked that we had mixed platoons. And so that helped me to kind of form a thing of, okay, this is how I can explain details of recruit training, because it's going to look very different to a former bootneck corporal who is used to a particular mode of instruction. Yeah. So it was actually a real help.
And And I think from a thing, Rob is obviously trained to use violence in his past thing, and also is offering spiritual care. What interested you about this apparent contradiction?
Um, well, when had a I'd had a background in martial arts myself, and when I became a Christian, I actually thought, okay, what place does this have in my life? And then somebody actually, where I went to church when I was at university, there were a couple of army people there, and one of these soldiers said it's all about love. Because if you love somebody, you're not going to allow them to be murdered without trying to intervene on their behalf. And that helped me to kind of, and in being a Hebrew scholar, in the Ten Commandments, the New King James or the King James Bible translated it, "Thou shalt not kill." Now there are a few words for kill in Hebrew. The one for kill generally is not the word that is used in the Ten Commandments. It's better to translate it as "You shall do no murder." So it's not about never killing, even though killing is not a great thing. It's sad and awful, but sometimes necessary. Whereas murder, unlawful killing, was what's been proscribed. So it's a, but it's a balance. I think that any Christian in the military has to kind of wrestle with, and yeah, very much for somebody who is been on the sharp end. It's an unavoidable series of questions you need to ask. I also wanted to play with people's minds a bit because they have a stereotype of a clergyman that is, somewhat perhaps effeminate or at least Rowan Atkinson like,
Yeah,
rather than somebody who is focused and capable of a range of responses to emergencies, including using force.
in the
Um,
Australian Army, you padres can carry weapons, can't they? Or
yeah,
small caliber weapons, isn't it? As opposed
yeah.
to, I think, in the British Army, they don't.
Yeah, the Australian Army. So before I left, well, when I first joined, chaplains had to train on the weapon on and that was only on the F-88 Ostire at the time, the service rifle, rather than the pistol, which um, some people found a bit confusing. Oh, give them a pistol, but no, they said rifle just like everyone else. But when I first joined, after you'd done the training with the rifle, you didn't have to, you could get a weapons waiver and you didn't have to handle weapons again, unless you were going to deploy with them. But before I left, keeping current with the weapon was required for chaplains as well as any other person in the army. Technically, a chaplain could refuse to carry a weapon, but a CO was also at liberty to not deploy that chaplain. So when I deployed, the CO of the deployment I was going on very outright asked me, "Are you willing to carry a weapon?" And I went, "Yeah, yes, sir, that's fine. I'll do that." And he said, "Well, I'm glad you said that because if you had said no, I couldn't take you because the risk to our non-combatant troops, medics, chaplains, doctors, is just as high because of the risk of insider attacks that we faced." And indeed, when I was briefed by um, the regiment before I deployed, this particular corporal said, here are some risks for you that you need to be especially aware of. And so I knew when it was that I was most likely to face that. Thankfully, I didn't have to in my case. But Australian Army chaplains have in the past. It has occurred. So First was in World War One, but it was a shovel that he used rather than a firearm.
You don't quite think of a padre taking up a shovel, but they used to
Oh,
use, obviously, the weapons in the trenches were unusual, isn't it? Like trench clubs and and other
yeah.
things.
He is quite a character. There's a guy called Fighting Mackenzie. There was an enormous Salvation Army officer, and yeah, he was quite the. Yeah, he had quite an interesting history. That there was another incident with him when in Cairo in World War One, partly because of soldiers getting sexually transmitted diseases, partly because they'd been robbed in that district, and partly because the prices had gone up. There was a riot involving Australian and New Zealand soldiers where they actually burned down the red light district of Cairo. And when the British military police were sent to stop them, they were promptly set upon and given a hiding. The Cairo Fire Brigade's hoses were hacked up with bayonets. And it was getting well out of hand, and somebody decided to turn out the Middlesex Regiment fully armed. And it happened that the Aussies in particular got on well with the Middlesex, and they, oh, okay, yeah, we'll go home now. But Fighting Mackenzie, this chaplain, was involved in deeply approving of this way of dealing with the den of iniquity. So if you can't reform it, just burn it down. Yeah,
There's a book in that story.
Yeah, there's been a couple written about him. Yeah.
Anyway, looking at specific books, I mean, obviously the first one, you wrote Echoes in the Wind. Rob arrives, as this unknown character at a training base. And I mean, I have to say, when I first looked at the Thorn, I thought this is going to be, where's it going to go here? But, you then obviously reveal about his history and what's he trying to escape? Was he trying to atone for something at the beginning of the story?
Oh, it's interesting actually, like with every sniper I've known, and I'd known a few both through target shooting and through the army. The ones who really thought about what they'd done, one in particular in Afghanistan, he was special forces, and I never even knew his name. He used to come to chapel, but he said to me, "I'm going to have to stop doing this because it's a bit like the Ring of Power and Lord of the Rings. If you don't set it aside, it's going to possess you." And he used to like that, just the power that they had to take life was something that probably they needed to stop doing at some point, because when it became easy, then it was becoming potentially a problem where you potentially do something wrong. And very much for the character of Rob, that's what's on his mind, is like, this is too easy, and I don't actually want to kill people very much. He just happened to be good at it. And there's a tension in Rob between the capability he has to be violent, but also the desire he has to actually not be that. And there's, I think, for a lot of people, that I wanted to present something of the force used with reluctance. That is, I suppose, what I'm trying to get across with him. But he's, I think, probably as a person, he's had ministry on the mind for some time, and decides to take the opportunity. But like a lot of ex-military people, in my mind, I think he wouldn't transition well to civilian parish work.
Mm-hmm.
And the first opportunity to be a chaplain would, okay, yeah. And he's like, at the time, he's unmarried. He doesn't have any connection, has any sort of thing tying him down. So it's a logical step for him. Whereas the female main character is a different kettle of fish. Yeah.
Oh, we're going to come on to her a bit. I think she obviously gets a bit more. I mean, if we look now at A Wind of Bitter Tears, it takes Rob back to Afghanistan, while Anne, who's obviously the love interest, without giving too much away from the first book, is facing a war crimes investigation back in Australia. So why is it important, do you think, to show the pressure of both being exerted on both of them simultaneously, and in a way very different pressure? And one is obviously extreme physical danger, the other is much more personal, whatever one might call it, professional.
I wanted to point out to people that it's not just combat that hurts. Yeah, a lot of people, there's a really touching thing happened in Australia recently that will illustrate my point. A man from Victoria decided that he was going to ride a Vespa to all of the Ashes games, the cricket. But that involves riding a Vespa clear across the Australian continent, which is a very long way. And so the first game was in Perth. So he had to ride to Perth, and he had to ride back to, I can't remember where the second test was, might have been Adelaide. Then he had to ride to Adelaide, then he had to ride to Melbourne. There was a ride to Brisbane and a ride to Sydney.
On a Vespa?
On a Vespa, which was completely, but he'd been suicidal. He was a public servant in the state of Victoria, and he became suicidal during the lockdowns and was deeply troubled by what had happened. And riding this Vespa became sort of this form of therapy. But a policeman in South Australia pulled him over at one point, not because he'd done anything wrong. It's very hard to even speed on a Vespa, but this police officer was just curious, like, what are you doing in the middle of, wow. And he got talking to the guy, and he started telling his story about mental health recovery. And the policeman who pulled him over had served in Afghanistan with the army. And this, former public servant went, oh, I'm sorry, I mean, my issues must seem nothing compared to being in combat. And the police officer went, no, you got it all wrong. It doesn't matter what it is. In some ways, it's traumatized you. It's not sort of like a competition, a league table. It's that you were genuinely affected by what happened to you, and it was genuinely bad. Whereas I think for me, there were some things I found easier about Afghanistan than, because when I came back from Afghanistan, we were short of chaplains in my brigade. So I took like 5 days leave, and then I was back at work. And, without going into too many details, I ended up dealing with 2 deaths in very quick succession, both of people, one who I knew slightly, or another who lived 5 doors up from me. And I'd seen him promoted the day I left Afghanistan. And he was dead, 2 weeks later. I knew him. And bringing a chaplaincy ministry into those sorts of situations where people are under that crushing weight of grief did far more damage to me than Afghanistan had done. Simply because when you're in theatre, if something happens, you've got the job to do the next day. But when you're here and you're supporting a family, you're actually dealing with the wreckage, and there is a sense of which you're very much at the mercy of how they're doing, and you've got to be really on your game and in the way you support them, because otherwise it can lead to disasters if you say the wrong thing. And and likewise, people who've been unfairly pursued by the military justice system, people who've been unfairly pursued by jealous, small-minded people within the service are traumatized, but in a different way. And I think sometimes we expect trauma and difficulty and mental struggle out of combat, out of a war zone. And that I think helps us to calibrate our expectations of life in that realm, but we don't expect it back here. And that means that certain parts of the impact are going to be greater. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, which brings it on actually to the, to the third, in the series, The Devil in the Downdraft. And Rob and Anne are now away from the battlefield, but the war has plainly followed them home. Is that the central idea of the novel, or what? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's about the breaking points, and but they don't look necessarily the same. Two people who've both been through difficult experiences have a different presentation when they're starting to crack. And Rob's thing echoes why I was medically discharged very, very closely. I was on my second posting to Kapuka when the medical discharge process began, because the medical centre, I went in there with my umpteenth cold or flu for the posting, and the nurse who was examining me said, "Do you know every time you're on call, you get sick without fail?" She said, "This is actually a really problematic sign." And so she sent me through to see the doctor. And doctor says, "Okay, what's happening is stress is basically grinding you down." And she said, you could almost say that you're becoming allergic to the army. So yeah, and that they were so familiar with that kind of thing happening that they went, "No, this, we can't keep exposing you to the risk of the chaos that you've dealt with." Though the army psych I went to see said that I'd probably been exposed to more than average for the time period. And I mean, again, it's not a competition, but it was. And the army psych, I really appreciated what he had to say. He said, "Look, I would hesitate to recommend that you go back to normal church life." Because I think your body and your mind can't deal with chaos very well anymore. And he said that may be a permanent thing you need to consider. So I appreciated that honesty. I thought that was very useful. And so, in particular, they said I ended up on all sorts of restrictions. I was only allowed to work a maximum of 40 hours a week. Because at Kapuka, it was normally 50 to 60 at least. And then I wasn't allowed to do casualty notifications. And when you're not allowed to do casualty notifications as a chaplain, essentially you have to put your hand on your heart and go, "I can't do the job." It was, I was able, and then sadly, in my case also, we had a son diagnosed with brain cancer at the end of that same year. So it just all sort of, it was a real train wreck of a year, that one. It was an absolute train wreck. So Rob's decline in mental health or in health generally, I wanted to show that is one way in which a person may show the effects of war and other sorts of stress. But Anne's is a very different one because, without going into too many spoilers, she had a lot of regrets, but she should also have been treated pretty badly at times. And I'd had dear friends become almost like punch drunk. There's one too many bad things happening, and as soon as something else bad happens, they just start to snap and get really aggressive and go, "Hey, hang on, nobody's attacking you at the moment, mate. You're really, really touchy." And that's partly because they had just been hit one too many times. or maybe 2, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or too many times. So
That brings us to Anne a bit more, because Anne has a substantial military career, and there's a substantial, the story builds, obviously, as you go through the 3 books. Did you always intend her to become as basic, as important as Rob? Or was it something that, as you wrote, you suddenly thought, hey, I can move her on a bit,
She certainly, I often joke to people, she got out of control. But she was quite. I wrote a feisty woman. I'm married to a feisty woman, and I didn't probably not quite as big. But then I thought, here's an opportunity also to have a bit of a tip of the hat to the women I'd served with, and the things they'd enjoyed, the friendships that they had made, and what they looked like, and so on. So yeah, it's certainly, she was a character. She grew, and when it came to writing the 3rd book, I thought, no, she needs to be just as important here as Rob, because I need to actually also, I wanted to also give permission to not just females who had served, but others who had served and endured similar things to her, give them permission to feel what they felt, rather than feeling their feelings were illegitimate simply because they weren't solely combat related.
And I think that brings on to, if I could just interrupt, I think, because obviously across the 3 novels, Rob and Anne encounter trauma, they encounter institutional betrayal, and also moral injury. How do you distinguish, do you think, between moral injury and the more familiar idea of post-traumatic stress?
Well, generally, moral injury is put under the same heading, but as post-traumatic stress. But its distinguishing factor is that it is actions or inactions that have occurred that violates a person's moral compass, if that's a really perhaps too simple description. But it can be a something that somebody's done themselves that that's eating them up inside. So they've perhaps done something either on deployment, like in combat, or have not stood up to somebody or something at some point, and it's eating them up. And it's probably, in my experience at least, of so I'd have soldiers come and see me, or other people in the army, and it was the far more dangerous. Like, I remember one fellow who, the CO I had in the cavalry regiment in particular, he was like, okay, if you see bad stuff, it's normal to feel bad. It's another injury, it's another illness, get it dealt with, crack on. He actually created quite a good atmosphere. So people were willing to come forward and disclose issues, and have them dealt with appropriately. And so, I could, if I thought somebody was in that sort of space, okay, we probably should send you to the doctor, the regimental medical officer, and then we'll look at psych support. And there are a series of options available, one of which that the Australian Army has available, which doesn't report back to the unit, so they can go and seek help on the side without having to declare if they don't feel like they can. But nonetheless, okay, there were options available, but with the moral injury thing, they had to come to peace with that action, and there was nothing a psychologist could really do in terms of normal psychological techniques. It really come down to looking at their worldview and how they dealt with any sense of being wronged or any sense of having done wrong. And from a Christian worldview, I have particular ways of answering those questions, obviously. But it was a bit of it's been a far more tricky one because excuse me. There was one fellow I spoke to once who had been on the scene of two fellows being killed in Afghanistan, and he was blaming himself for the event. Now, as I listened to him describe it, I just thought there is no way that you could possibly be responsible for this. You're not omniscient. You don't know everything. You couldn't know. You weren't the only person there who had the ability to find bombs. So, and I'm listening to him. I'm thinking, I want to say this, but I don't think I should. I just listen what he's got to say. And really what it was his heart's cry that his mates had died. And blaming himself was one way of trying to feel something other than crushing grief. And yeah, I really felt concerned for him far more than some people who had picked bits of body up from the desert. Yeah, simply because they went, oh dear, this is terrible. And they would talk about with each other how terrible that was. And so they were already on the first day starting to begin to externalize and process some of this stuff, whereas he just took all of this responsibility in himself. He was a corporal. Now, I get why he felt responsible. But there's only so much one person can do. And when you're in a war zone, the enemy gets a say, and they aren't going to make it easy for you to defeat their weapons. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, just obviously we're running out of time, but just a few more things. I mean, how have former soldiers and military families responded to your books, and have you found that has it surprised you?
Yes. A few things have surprised me. The funnier one is the character of Anne is quite polarizing amongst women. Some women love her, and some women say that she is a scary piece of work. And yes, she is
at the beginning, isn't she?
Yeah,
you go, whoa.
She is a scary piece. She is a scary piece of work, but I was just trying to portray an actual person rather than somebody who I thought the readers would like necessarily. Military people and families have generally reacted quite well, partly because I've tried to talk about not just combat, but the relationships, the banter, the silly things that happen that are funny, the sad things that happen are definitely not. And so to give voice to not just myself, but others. Non-military people have responded fairly well too. Some with shock, just sheer shock that, and to explain it with an anecdote, Army Reserve platoon comes through Kabuka in 2018, and a lot of the Army Reserve recruits are actually serving police officers. And an incident of bullying occurred in this platoon that was actually perpetrated by somebody who is in law enforcement. And the person who caught him in the act of bullying another recruit was a corporal who had seen significant combat of the most visceral kind. He was normally actually one of the calmest instructors, but he grabbed this fellow by the scruff of the neck and corrected him with some vigor. And the other, when this corporal had finished, the other recruits could be heard applauding in the lines. But one of these police officers said to me after the incident, and this fellow was removed from training and he actually resigned at his own request because he'd been humiliated and couldn't really find a way back from there. And one of the other police officers who was a recruit, she said, you need to actually understand how aggressive you people are right from the get-go. So there is a level of functioning aggression there that is just not normal for the rest of the community. And I think that's been what surprised people about the books, is that wow, military people can get really aggressive if they need to, or particularly army, simply because the nature of the job is land warfare, which is more visceral by nature. So yeah, that's been a couple of the common reactions. Yeah.
I mean, I have to say, it is, the books are, they are really, actually, there's so much more than one thinks they're going to be. I mean, it really is an amazing trilogy so far. So what next? Have you got another book in the series, Rob and Anne?
Yep, I can see it on the screen right in front of me. So it's the final one is Angel of Wrath, which is them out of the military and their struggles and with adjusting to life after the uniform. And nested within it are probably some of my thoughts about how this struggle can be undergone most productively, because it's going to be a struggle, but you need to find a purpose and find a rhythm, because for so long after I left the military, I just felt like I was just waiting for chaos. And because we were dealing with a son with a terminal illness, I actually had a bit of a feel of chaos when I left the military. It was pretty awful in its own way. But the thing I had to come to terms with is this chaos is not normal. And that I had to find a way of living a boring life, I suppose, or at least a life that wasn't revolving around the possibility of a sudden emergency, which is a lot of what the army was. And to kind of help my mind relax out of that constant sort of state of arousal. And yeah, I've got particular thoughts on that that'll come through in the fourth book. And that will be that for that series. I want to leave that there, but leave it open so that people can see that the characters go on with their lives, but not open so that I'm likely to write other books in the series. Yeah.
And then what else? You also looking at a non-fiction book, I seem to remember,
Yep.
which is very close to my military past.
Yeah. Well, this is broadly speaking, on British cavalry operations on the Western Front during the German 1918 offensive. This was brought to my attention through reading history, particularly the Australian accounts of the Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, where time after time the Australian historians and the commanders on the ground writing at the time said British cavalry saved their bacon that day, or over those days, because of the way they located, dislocated, and disrupted the enemy, but also the intelligence feed about the axis of advance and all that sort of thing. And I also was privileged to actually have met some World War One diggers who, the Australian Army in the First World War was a volunteer amateur army. And it came to the Western Front at a time when, sadly, the old British regular army had largely disappeared because of its enormous sacrifice in the first year and a bit of the war. And a couple that I met said that the only real professional British soldiers that they met were cavalry, because they were the units that still had largely their pre-war
The people who
constitution.
joined, exactly.
Yeah. And they were very impressed by their professionalism. And I think I wanted to. I'm often been frustrated by depictions of the First World War. Really frustrated, because I thought they were really unfair. And I learned a bit more about, the tactics that had been developed when facing machine gun fire on horseback. And it wasn't simply charging. There was actually some well-developed strategy for dealing with fully automatic weapons. So I thought, well, I'd love to do a deep dive into this and to see. Yeah, I'll probably have to. What I'm beginning with is trying to get a bigger sweep, and if I can get enough information or enough of a thing to narrow it to a more focused story, then good. But I'm also willing to do a bigger sweep of history. It's really a matter of it's going to involve a deep dive into official histories and regimental diaries and so forth, and also the doctrine and tactics of the time, so that people can get a bit of a sense about how tactics developed, but also what was already in place. Because they'd already...
I had my, couple of months ago, I was in Villers-Bretonneux, and I put that little post, and I followed where the 17th Lancers, the antecedent of my old regiment, had done essentially a charge, which it's actually written. They said a non-standard advance, at full gallop to assist where the Australians, south of Villers-Bretonneux, and standing there looking across that area, and you're just thinking, wow, and then, that whole area is just amazing. But I was going to call you Rob. I'm going to be Roger. Mr. Llewellyn. Thank you very much. I think we've got to wrap it up. It's been a fascinating talk. I learned more in your books about, probably what a padre goes through than one ever thinks. And I just think it's such an unusual subject, having a ex-sniper padre who is the hero and dealing with this physical and moral issues in a really great way. I'm so grateful you came to Chiselbury, and I've really been delighted to publish it. And I think we've really got to push this, because this needs to do well. I think there's, it's a story that people should know. And I think it's also interesting as a Brit looking at actually how similar and how different Australian Army is. It's quite, there are so many similarities. And then you think, what on earth are they doing that for? And probably the same as us. So, fantastic. So, if I can sort of wind it up, I would just like to, any readers or any watchers, these are the books, Echoes in the Wind, the first one, Wind of Visitors, and The Devil in the Downdraft. They are all available on Kindle and on paperback, and they are really well. And we look forward to the next, and final episode. But Roger, thank you very much for your time, and
thank you, sir.
I look forward to doing, to working with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you.